afternoon, everyone. Hello. Just okay. Now that I'm trying to see all the squares, I can't find all the people on screen.
Okay,
now I found it. Okay, thank you.
no problem.
And the notice about the recording, I can't seem to get rid of it. Okay, Nava, if you can manage to disappear it, that would be great. It's blocking my view. Okay, welcome everybody. Shalom, shalom. Good to see you all again, you who are here. And my usual appeal to anyone who feels moved, who's not visible at the moment, anyone who feels moved to make themselves visible, since after all, the story of Avraham is so much about appearing and disappearing. So if a few more of you appeared, that would be really wonderful. And with that, I want to just launch into the painful and difficult story of the Akedah. It's not something, this is not a story that one engages with lightly, just because it's there. It's an extremely troubling story. And it's a story that's always been troubling, right? Especially in our day, but I think it's always been troubling. Going back to the beginning, going back to the days of the Midrash, to the times of Chazal, what shadowed this story was always the idea that people might think that Avraham was crazy. Just as, if you remember, last week, when Avraham was wandering around from one place to the other and not finding, and not without any clear destination. Just as there, the Midrash says, people were talking about him as a crazy person. Have you ever seen such a thing? A person who wanders and has no idea what his destination is and just keeps moving in this way. So there's a sense of a lonely old man, if I can put it like that. Look at that old man. A lonely old man with all the weight attaching to those words. Meshuggah. And the fear of madness. And you have a similar motif around the Akedah, the second Lech Lecha. This is the Lech Lecha that ends Avraham's life with God. God's last appearance to Avraham. Kach et bincha, take your son, Yechitzcha, your only one, Asher ahavta, whom you love, Yitzhak. And again, instead of just clearly telling him who he is to take, just as God hadn't at the beginning, he hadn't told Avraham where he was to go. Here too, God delays telling him exactly who is the object that is to be taken. And what we have before that is a description of relationships, ways of thinking of Avraham's relationship with this unnamed person, your son, whom you love, your only one, right? Belongs to you, is attached to you. Take him up to the top of a mountain, which I will tell you. I'll name it when the time comes. Again, delay. And bring him up as a burnt offering there on one of those mountains. Doesn't Kierkegaard, the sentence that always remains in my mind from Kierkegaard's great study of the Akedah, fear and trembling, he called it, is a sentence in which he says something like, how many generations have studied this story and have known it by heart? He's a devout Christian. Have known it by heart. But how many has it rendered sleepless? That's not important, your studying of it. You haven't really read it unless you've lain awake at night worrying about it. There's something, unless you've understood, it's what I'll call its madness potential, the way in which it might drive you crazy. And I'm coming back now to this theme. The relationship between Avraham and God. Now, like all relationships, we start by comparing it to other relationships. There are two aspects to relationships. You could say that I myself, I have a self, and I relate to what is not myself. Anything I relate to, any person, is not me. There's me and there's not me. So this is in psychoanalysis, psychoanalytic thinking, that is the basic split, that there is me and the world that I have inside me. And then there are those things out there that are clearly not me. And I should have boundaries between myself and that, what is outside me. I'm not one with that. I am separate from that. And that way, sanity lies. If I can keep myself separate from what is outside me, then at least I know my own mind. I have a certain clarity about what it is I think. But if I allow myself to have the boundaries slip, if I allow everything to get merged with each other, thinking of a relationship with another person, people will, of course, have very different reactions to the threat of slipping boundaries. That you become so attached to the other person, or so in some way identified with the other person. You know, marriage is one of the main structures. The structure of marriage is one in which we really have to deal with this, and we deal with this in many different ways and over a whole life history. Who do I want the other person to be for me? Do I want him to be more or less myself? I'm relating, I'm merged with the other person. Dveikut, there's that great love, that's great merging. He's continuous with me in the world. Or do I want to feel very clearly that he's different from me, that he is other? And there are advantages to that. If your primary desire is for sanity, I'll call it, surely it should be all our desire. Everyone wants to be sane. But perhaps some people are more fixated on sanity than others. If that is your absolute desire, then you will want as much separation as possible. So I should know clearly what I am and what he is, and we have rules, and yet you can understand that. And there's a fear of boundaries being blurred. When suddenly you find that in some way the other has infiltrated you, and you no longer know yourself from him. I'm speaking in my I. That could be a subject of uneasiness. On the other hand, it could be just the opposite, that I so much love the other person that I'm disturbed to recognize that he is really a separate person. I would like to feel that we are the same in all things. Now, in general, that is a short period, perhaps, of what we call love. That love has in it, perhaps towards the beginning, that is very much the sense of being continuous with the other person, twin souls, that there's no difference between us, right? I am Heathcliff, remember in Wuthering Heights, Kathy says. And that is the sense of twin souls. And then in the way of ordinary sane life, we place boundaries and roles and differentiations, and we have identities and so forth. And the problem then is, what are you most afraid of? What is Winnicott, D.W. Winnicott, Donald Winnicott, the great British psychoanalyst, said one of the interesting and powerful things that he says is that we need to develop a kind of rhythm in life of unity and separation. Even in marriage or in any relationship with another person, or it could be in relationship to the environment, as we now call it. In other words, with the forests and the seas and the rivers, that on the whole we are separate and we are defined as different from our environment. But in certain modes and in certain moods and in certain ways of thinking, we have to recognize that we are continuous, that we really, in a sense, flow into each other. And there has to be a rhythm somewhere of moving from unity to separation and back to unity. And that life is not, on the whole, only one of those two. Keep yourself far apart or come together. Or as I call it in the theme of this year's learning, intimacy and otherness. There is intimacy and then there's otherness. There's chesed and then there is din. So then, why is it that when God tells Avraham to start traveling yet again, Lech Lecha, and sacrifice his son, that we read that the journey takes 3 days. Now, in general, we're not given any clear indication of what Avram's state of mind is. It doesn't say at all, and it doesn't say anything clearly psychological, emotional about how Avram felt when God said this to him. It's left to our imagination. And we could imagine many different things, especially if you read classic commentaries and Hasidic commentaries. There are some that actually go as far as to say that he couldn't wait. He was so burning with enthusiasm at the idea of obeying God's command that he just couldn't wait. It was unequivocal joy and love. Probably most of us don't find that easy to identify with. But that's one possible reading, because the Torah doesn't tell us how he felt. What does it do? There are slight indications, and they're usually very small and very material things, very factual. For instance, that he got up and saddled his own ass in the morning, instead of waiting for his servants to do it. And that, in rabbinic interpretation, means that he was eager, that in some way he couldn't wait. There was a certain, what should I call it, fire, frenzy, fever that took hold of him and that set him off early on his journey. But then we read it took him 3 days. The journey took him 3 days. Why are we told that? Is it important to know that, just for the sake of geography, to know how far away Har Moriah is from where Avraham was? And of course, again, the sages, Chazal, assume that there's more to it than that. And so they have a very strong statement, which goes like this. Lama icher, again, why did God delay in showing him his destination right away? Why did God make him travel for 3 days before he finally was able to lift up his eyes and see the place from far away? Why are we given this sense of time passing before he actually sees where he's going? And the answer that Chazal give, it's in Rashi basically, Shelo Yomar, so that people shouldn't say, God threw him into panic confusion. God came down on him with this commandment and right away told him right there. As soon as he gave him the command, he pointed to the mountain and he said, right there, you should go now and do it. If God had done that, then people might say he was hustled to such an extent. He was hassled. He was made to feel that there was no time to think. And that's why he did it. And he simply went crazy. V'taraf da'ato. God threw him into such panic and such confusion that he did it. He was ready to do it. If he had had time to think about it, lihimalech im libo, wonderful, lihimalech, yeah, that's the expression that's used, lihimalech im libo, el libo, then he would not have done it. So people are, in the end, trying to destroy the achievement of the Akedah by saying, well, it's only because God rushed him and threw him into a mad state. So he was in a state of madness when he did the act, or when he drew the knife, let's say. And that, I suggest, is not just that people shouldn't say this, but that Avraham shouldn't be able to say this. It's actually in the singular, Shelo Yomar, not Shelo Yombru. That Avraham shouldn't at any point suspect himself of having done this act in madness. Now that's a very modern, it has that ring to me of absolutely the way we are now. What is the first thing we would think if a voice came to us and made us, somehow infiltrated us and made us feel that we had no choice but to listen to it? To kill a child. As Kierkegaard says, that would be craziness. I wouldn't do it in that situation because I would immediately think of the possibility of madness, that I've gone mad. And the interesting thing is that Rashi and the Midrash, going back 2,000 years, when the whole question of sanity and insanity was not quite as complex as it is now, there was a black and white matter, that immediately comes up. It comes up as a possible interpretation of the commandment to sacrifice one's son, which is the Akedah. And it's an interpretation that God wants to prevent Avraham from having to face the possibility of madness. And so he delays for 3 days so he can thoroughly think it through, so that afterwards he should be able to say, I did it in my own real mind. My mind was quite composed when I decided to do it. But there is that fear of madness. And that fear of madness, then, I think comes from the sense of, who am I? Am I the person who so much longed for a child? Or am I the person who in some way now, the God who has been the God of love and chesed all along, who's been encouraging me to connect with people, to connect, and the imagery we looked at last week with the perfume and the dew and the subtle effects that are supposed to radiate out from Avraham to other people. And suddenly God has turned around on me, and I don't recognize myself now. I don't know which way to face God. He doesn't seem to want what he always wanted of me. He always wanted chesed of me. He always wanted ahava. And now it seems he wants something very different. And Abraham now has, over the course of 3 days, and we're supposed to feel the burden of that, lehimalech el libo, to try to consult his own mind, to find out where his own mind is in all this. What does he think he is really supposed to do in reaction to God's command? Now, to me, that suggests that the primary issue, is not exactly the issue of obedience. It's often put that way, that the Akedah is what teaches us absolute obedience to God. Unquestioning, counterintuitive, even if it's against all our instincts, that's what has to be, and Abraham is the primary example of obedience. And I'd like to put a big question mark around that. I don't think the main problem, the main nisayon, after all, we are told from the very beginning that this is a test of Abraham. V'ha'elokim nisa at Abraham. Now, we're never told that in any of the other tests which human beings are subjected to by God. We're never told exactly at the beginning that this was a test, and that Abraham may even have known it. On some level, he knows that he's being probed, that he is something is to be found out about him. Something is to be discovered about his own inner world. It's not just obedience. And here we have an agonizing situation in the relationship between Avraham and God. It's not a simple matter of just do what I tell you. Somewhere there is this issue of internal life and of subjectivity that Avraham has to learn. Something has to emerge that he didn't know before. The way Ramban puts it on the idea of testing, he says the idea of testing here, it's a very famous classic comment. It's not giving a pass-fail grade. It's not that kind of test. Will you pass or will you fail? Lenasot, he says, is lehotzi min ha-koach el hapoal. To bring forth from the potential to the actual. In other words, to test someone in this case is to elicit from them, to bring out of them what they don't yet know about themselves, something that can't yet be assumed about them and what they would do in a certain situation. It's all hypothetical until the moment comes when God tests him. Now, this is the acid test. What will you do? And perhaps just as important, how will you do it? How or why will you do it? And so we have something much more inward turned than we might at first have thought. And perhaps the risk run of brushing with madness. That madness somewhere is there at the edges of the process that he has to go through. Winnicott, one of his famous aphorisms, is where he says, he is poor indeed, who is only sane. He is poor indeed who is only sane. That is, if you are only sane, as if you can be sane, but you can't be only sane. You have to have had some experiences of something else. Otherwise, you are a very poor person. You have a very poor, there's no richness of experience in you if all you're concerned with is sanity. And that fills you. So the idea is there in first of all, certainly in Winnicott's thinking and in psychoanalytic thinking, that part of life has to do with getting mixed up, not remaining clear and identified, but getting mixed up with God in some way, that God somehow, or with the other, the beloved other, in some way things becoming merged, so you don't know exactly who you are and who the other is. Now, this is a rather long introduction. I want to move now into the first midrash that we'll look at together. I'm not going to read with you the Meshech Chochmah in number 1, but we'll go straight to number 2. The theme I'm interested in now is a theme that comes to its head in the story of the Akedah, with the idea, the midrashic idea of hirhurim, of Avraham suffering from qualms, misgivings. It becomes a kind of motif in the midrash. והאלוקים ניסה את אברהם אחרי הדברים האלה. After these things, God tested Abraham. Before we get to the Akedah, we have it already indicated that Abraham is a person who is full of anxieties, afterthoughts, questions about his own mind. Questions about, am I justified or not justified in thinking this way, in acting this way? Now that's very internal. And the Midrash goes to one of those very anxious places inside a human being, where one is oscillating, where one is not sure how to look at things. Chapter 15, in last week's Parshat, Perek Tedvav, after the story of the 4 kings and the 5 kings, the battles have been fought and won. Avraham should be happy, but instead, what mood is he in? God has to say to him, Al tira anochi magen lecha. Don't be afraid, I will protect you. That's in the text of the Torah. Why is Avraham afraid after he's won the battles? After it's a moment of joy, surely, for a properly single-minded person. Yeah, for a totally sane person, it would be a moment of joy. But Avraham, he has qualms. Shehaya avinu Avraham mitpachet, the second line in the Hebrew. He was afraid in himself. He was afraid of himself. It's reflexive. He was anxious, let's say. He said, would you say that all those large populations of human beings that I've just killed, that's what a victory is. I've killed all those many, many people. Maybe there was one pure soul among them. Maybe there was one tzaddik among them. So it's a kind of pushing it to the absurd. I'm not saying there were 10 righteous souls, just one. If there had been just one, then maybe I'm completely wrong. I've done something terrible in killing all those people. And so he has this anxiety. And God answers him under a rather elaborate mashal, parable. I won't go into the details. Read it yourselves. You're always cordially invited to follow up the sources on Shabbat, perhaps. And God simply says to him, the bottom line is, those people were all sinners. I assure you, all those people had to be removed from the scene, and you just did my work for me, so there's nothing to worry about. That's the first reading. Then another reading, Rabbi Levi says, similar reflex on the part of Avraham. Haya mitpached. He was again anxious. It's further than halfway down. And he said, would you say, again, that tomar, would you say, here's a hypothesis, here's a possibility that I hadn't thought about before. What is always a negative possibility. Oh dear, what if? What if? And this time, it's a more pragmatic one. I killed all those great kings. What if they had left behind little princes that will grow up and come out against me? So that's a more practical worry. That's another word, that expression it's used in the Midrash about Avraham's habit of mind. He was always worrying. He's always anxious, mitpached. And the third one, as we'll see, is meharher. And we'll say something about that. So this is the second thing he's worried about. And again, God says to him, don't be afraid, I'll protect you. And then there's an explanation given that however many idolaters gang up against you, don't worry about the future. I will always protect you. So again, you are perfectly right to do it, even on a pragmatic level, because I will always be there. So God gets rid of his worry, as it were. The third level is the most rarefied. It's the least practical. Avraham thinks to himself, the form is a little different this time. I went down into the fiery furnace and I was saved. And there is a reference to the fiery furnace, which is a clear reference, of course, to that esoteric midrash. I say esoteric because there's no indication of it in the Torah itself. But the midrash is very well known. Clearly, it's very well known to Chazal. They will refer to it, they'll cross-refer to it freely. And if you were here last week, Ramban and Rambam both refer to it as part of Avraham's early life history, as if that's just a historical fact. You remember the story, Avraham smashes his father's idols, and then his father hauls him up for judgment in front of Nimrod, and Nimrod condemns him to death in a fiery furnace, to throw him into the furnace, and he is saved. And so Avraham remembers important moments in his life now. Crises. And he said, I went down and I was saved. That went down means I went down to death. I died and I was saved. All right. Almost died. Yeah. But yaradati is a very graphically dramatic way of putting it. I went down into the wars against the kings, these dangerous, overwhelming wars, and I was saved. So would you say that I've received all my reward in this world? I've used up all my credit in this world. Could you say that? In which case, I'm in a bad condition. I've used up all my olam haba. Yes, I've used up all my eternal life because the danger, God saved me from such dangers, such miracles were done for me that I can't expect to have any credit left over. Now, this banking image, as if there's a limited amount. God comforts him and says, don't be afraid, I'm protecting you. Everything I've done for you in this world is for free. So suddenly you got a free run in this world. That's what God is. Whatever good things I did for you, that's just the way it was. Forget the banking image. Everything remains for you for the world to come. Now, I'm not so much interested in the theology of this. I'm interested in this habit of worrying. From very practical worries, today I won, perhaps tomorrow I'll lose. You know that one. That's a very common Jewish worry. All right, I've been too successful today, I've got to pay for it tomorrow. There is that, call it neurotic worry. To the most spiritual worry, that in some way, if God is too good to me, then I am left with nothing. Right? In a way, he has taken upon himself what belongs to me, and I'm left with no credit at all for when it comes to important things. And that is part of human experience. If one has been too fortunate in some way to feel a little worried, perhaps that's it now, not just on a practical level. Now, all this was under being anxious. That was the word, mispached. But now we come to the hirhur, to the idea of hirhurim. And this is number 3 on your page. This is Rashi. The story immediately following the Akedah, which ends the Parshat, which is really just, it was after these things, Vayugadla Avraham. Avraham was told that how the family has been developing back home. in Haran, and that Rivka has been born. So he gets family news, and that's the end of the parsha. And here Rashi says, Achar hadvarim ha'ele, after these things. And Rashi comments, he was told, when he came back to Mount Moriah, Avraham was meharher. V'omer, meharher is worrying. It's connected with the word leharot, to become pregnant, herayon, hara, yeah, which means to be pregnant with unformed thoughts, suddenly to be filled with anxieties, apprehensions, what ifs, yeah, what we might call, depending if that's how we want to look at it, and that's the question, how do we look at such herhurim? Do we regard them as neurotic characteristics, a neurotic tendency always to be second-guessing whatever factual thing has just happened, and thinking, yes, but what if I'm going to pay for it, and so on. In other words, some kind of mental health issue, again, a problem of madness. Or does it actually tell us something about the conscientiousness of Avraham and his imagination, his live imagination, that he can never take it for sure that he is right, that he always has the possibility of having been wrong. Maybe that's a virtue. How are we supposed to take it? Hirhurim, what is he worried about at that stage after the Akedah? It's very powerful. He says, if my son had been slaughtered by now, he would have left without children. Now there is it's a created hypothesis. A sensible person would think, I don't have to think about that. He's alive. He can still have children. Why am I bothering myself thinking about what if? If he had been dead, I'd have been left with nothing, without children. It's my fault. I should have married him off while the going was good, even when I didn't think there was any rush at that time. There was no reason for hurrying, but I should have done it right away to get him married to one of the local girls. And then God answered him by sending him the news that Rivka was born, which is a kind of answer to his worry, to his hirhur. You don't have to worry. The future is all set. And where do we get this word hirhur from here? Somehow it belongs to that expression, achar hadvarim ha'ele. After these things. What is that mentality of after this and this and this? Then what happens? You'll say on a practical level, the next story happens. God lets him know that Rivka was born. But for Chazal, they're opening up another possibility, that after the facts of the past, after things have happened in the past, what's the next thing that happens? In an Avraham kind of person, hirhurim. After the facts, there are the interpretations of the facts. There are the inner questionings about how do I understand the facts? How do I read them? And that inner life of the human being, which is here called hirhurim, we can either regard as neurotic, or we can say it's a very important reflexive function of how we are in the world. It's what leads us perhaps to be more ethical and to be more demanding on ourselves. But in a way, it leaves us restless, because it's very hard ever to be satisfied with any state of affairs. But it's always that fruitful worrying mode that comes into play. And now we come to the Akedah. After these previous examples of hirhurim, we come now to the Akedah. Number 4. After these things, and I'm reading it rather quickly. After these things, after hirhurei dvarim, after the worries about these things, right? After the cogitations about the past and what I thought in the past, perhaps I was wrong, perhaps all that was, I had prejudices of various kinds. I have to get beyond my prejudices, right? Thinking of it that way, right? There's a certain very thoughtful kind of mind that always is open to the possibility that I have been ruled by certain assumptions and certain prejudices. And now I need perhaps to open myself up to a hirhur, to questioning what I've always thought. Right? So I'm trying to show that it's a delicate business how one, real life is difficult. If you have someone who's talking to you and you feel how they tend very much to have hirurim all the time, you could be wondering, even if you're not a therapist, I think there are some therapists here, you could be wondering, is this a kind of neurotic habit of always undoing oneself? Or is it actually a very thoughtful and productive way of relating to one's own mind? But here we have it with the Akedah, me here. Who had these thoughts, these afterthoughts? Avraham had them. What he said was, Samachti v'simachti et hakol. I've been happy and I have made everyone happy. That's the description of his life. I've rejoiced and I've rejoiced everybody. Lots of meals he invited people to, lots of brachot, lots of visitors, right? It's been one long party. V'lo hifrashti lakadosh baruch hu, parachad. I've never set aside from this feast, this bounty, one bullock, one ram, some animal for sacrifice. In all my life, I have never denied myself and my others, my friends, those who are with me. I have never denied myself anything and handed it over to God, separated it out for God. No sacrifice, in other words, lo hikrafti. I have not offered any sacrifices. Now, that is such an unexpected and very profound moment in Avraham's life. It's the end of his life, basically. It's after he's got everything he wanted. He's got a son. Right? He's got two sons. He's got the future is assured. That's where we left him before the Akedah. And suddenly he thinks, maybe the basis of my whole life has been hedonistic. I've just been having a good time all my life. I've been pleasing myself in pleasing others. It's possible. Certainly, it's a deep question. What have I really been doing? Gratification all my life. I never had a hard moment. I never denied myself. I never sacrificed anything to God. And that becomes a very profound second thought, second guess. God answers him, but I always understood that that good life that you had was conditional. If I would ever ask you to sacrifice your very son, you wouldn't hold back. In other words, I always knew the truth about you, that it was not hedonism, and that actually you were always a part of your mind. Perhaps your unconscious mind was always ready to sacrifice to me even the dearest. But God says that you don't need to actually show it, you don't need to prove it, because I know that's who you are. But then what happens is, of course, and so let's just follow the midrash here. And it's not only God, and not only in Avraham's own mind, but the angels in heaven are also criticizing Avraham for not sacrificing anything. And God answers them also, but I know he would sacrifice his son and wouldn't hold back. And then he moved to Yitzhak and Ishmael. This is all still in the air. There's no test yet. Yitzhak and Ishmael were having an argument, and one was saying, I'm more precious than you because I was circumcised at 13 years old. That's Yitzhak. That's Ishmael, I'm sorry. And Yitzhak was saying, no, I'm more precious than you because I was circumcised at 8 days old. Ishmael then says, I'm more precious than you. Why? Because I was tested when I was 13 years old, and I could have refused. I had the choice, and I went along with whatever it was that God wanted of me. In this case, it was circumcision. Whereas you were a baby, what did you know? You didn't have any power of choice at that point. And Yitzhak then answers him. What can he answer? It's true. I was just a baby. I don't get any credit for that. So he answers, Halavai haya nigla alai. I wish God would be revealed to me, and would tell me to cut off one of my limbs. I wouldn't hold back. In other words, never mind circumcision, which is not exactly a limb. It's But even that, even to amputate one of my miyad, and I think this ending applies to the whole midrash. Miyad, Elokim nisa at Avraham. God tested Avraham. Immediately after all these questions arose about Avraham's authenticity or Yitzhak's authenticity, and that immediately the implication is that there's some kind of desire that Yitzhak has to be tested. Not to have it as a what if, but actually to know. I should know for sure what my mind is. I should know what I would do. And the same with Avraham. God tested Avraham, and the Midrash says it's missing here somehow from the other page. God said, Harei Hasha'ah. God said, now is the moment in that case. Harei Hasha'ah means now is the moment in which the test has to happen. Why? Because you wished for it. God has enough trust in Avraham in this midrash. But if Avraham is so full of reflexive worries about himself, he has such a sense of his own complexity, which he doesn't really understand. He doesn't yet know who is really me. What would I do? So then God says, well, you asked for it. There's something in you that wants it. There's something in you that wants the actual test. There's a desire for sacrifice. And Avraham becomes, and Yitzhak too, in some strange way, although I'm not focusing on him. I think Yitzhak is really different. But Avraham primarily becomes sacrificial man, you might say. He becomes the person who has an intensity around the issue of sacrifice. There's a kind of knot in his mind around the idea of sacrifice that can only be resolved if it's acted out. If God actually tells him to do it, and then Avraham will see in the very truth how he reacts to that. Now this hirhur of Avraham, the fact that he tends to this sort of rumination, this sort of worrying about himself and his own potential responses to God, what is it that he really would do if he were faced with a situation? And suddenly the situation is upon him. And the situation, I want to, for a few minutes now, to talk about what Gaston Bachelard, the French philosopher, psychoanalyst who I mentioned last week, what he calls, in a book called The Psychoanalysis of Fire. That is, last week we were talking about brides and beauty and desire and perfume and dew. And there were various images to try to express something about the inner life relating to something outside. How do you allow yourself to be impacted or to impact on others? Now the image is fire. The imagery is fire. And fire stands for life and stands for death. It stands for intensity of life, burning fire, and it stands for the end of life, for the destruction of life. There is such a thing, Bachelard says, as the call of the funeral pyre. That's a very dramatic and powerful, perhaps overpowerful way of putting things. I think only the French really enjoy this sort of this sort of expression. That is, that there is an intense draw, there's an intense lure to throw oneself into the fire. It's not only something we're afraid of. Clearly, we're afraid of fire. There's no question about that. But fire is not just an actual physical thing. Fire is, as Bachelard writes very, very powerfully and beautifully, he says the most important use of fire, perhaps, for human beings is not just the actual fire that heats and warms and cooks food and, it has various practical functions. It's the fire that we sit around in the hearth, where the fire is safely contained in the fireplace. We sit around there and we think. We indulge in reverie. And of course, you may remember looking into fires. I don't know how old you would have to be to have had a live fire in your fireplace. I still remember that. sitting and looking endlessly at a fire, right? Like Ba'omer, whenever the opportunity is. And the various thought dreams that one can have, the reverie that one has when one looks at fire, the activity of fire. What does it mean to us in our imagination? What does it suggest? What does it get us thinking and wanting and fearing when we look at fire? And one of the themes of fire, he wants to say, Bachelard wants to say, is a desire for the fire. What is it that fire offers? Why is it that one does have certain cultures in which people go into the fire, or through the fire? And the way he puts it is something like this. He says, watching the fire, one feels in oneself a kind of desire for the change that fire goes through, change set so quickly. Things that are in the fire are transformed very quickly from one thing to another thing. There is a sense of transformation. There's a sense of the possibilities of becoming more than, not just less than, but more than what one was originally, of being fused with the fire, of becoming part of something much larger that's beyond oneself. In his chapter on this, one of his chapters, Bachelard talks about an essay by Georges Sand, another great French writer, S-A-N-D, 19th century French philosophical writer, poetic philosophical writer. And she talks about someone who's approaching Mount Etna, the volcano on Mount Etna, and he's staying in an inn where he sits by the fire and dreams, has a reverie in front of the fire in which he watches the moths shooting into the fire, as if they're attracted into the glowworms are attracted to the fire. And the thinker, the dreamer, thinks this is just a kind of small form of that great fire on top of the mountain that I'm going to look at. That is the lure of the volcano. Empedocles was the Greek figure who threw himself into the volcano to unite with God, to give up this earthly bounded existence in which he's just that ridiculous thing with a body and a very great limits, and to become a god, as it were, to become part of the infinite. And in their very small way, these worms and these glow creatures, these flying creatures, are demonstrating the same kind of fascination, to go up in smoke. What would that sound like? It uses expressions like this. The idea then of the fire smoldering in a soul more surely than it does under the ashes. That in one's own soul there is a fire that burns. What is the desire for the fire? It could be, in one moment he talks about the desire to lose everything to gain everything. Now that is it's a particular state of mind. We don't go around thinking these things rationally and sanely. But there are moments in which we feel that if we really want to gain something very large, then we have to sacrifice everything. Even before there is a real occasion in which it becomes a real question. Is this worth it? Is this, right? I'm going to give up my life to save someone else's life, right? That would have a certain amount of rationality to it. But that is rooted in something less rational, which is that idea that you can gain much more in life if you live in the moment, if you don't only look to survive, if your main and only desire is not just to live as long as possible, but to use up your life, right? To consume your life in a fire, right? Consumption. You would rather live intensely in one moment than just go on in a kind of dull existence. Now, I think we are quite ambivalent about this, most of us, I would think. Some of us would rather go on living for a long time rather than give it all up in one moment. At the same time, that we would really have very poor experience if we never knew about the other thing. If we never knew about what Chazal call koneh olamo b'sha'a achat, acquiring one's world in one moment. I put the midrash on your page in number 5. And this is the source that I want to place as a counterweight to the French sources that I'm just going to talk about for another couple of minutes. We'll get to it, to number 5, to this rather dubious hero who is told in the end, as if there's a very deep truth in this. Yesh shekoneh olamo beharbe shanim. There are those who get there, or get to great things over the course of many years, hard work. That's, you might call, the sane, rational way of doing it. And there are those who go up in a flash of fire in one moment, and who, in a sense, in sheer intensity, put an end to their lives. Now, there are 2 models. Now, if the French say it, then it's one thing. If Chazal say it, it's something else. Let me go on with the French for another minute. So here was Gaston Bachelard. Then there's someone who's way more, he's more edgy, he's more out there. And that is Georges Bataille, Bataille. And he has a book called The Theory of Religion. He is a philosopher, a philosopher of extremity, a philosopher of extreme notions. In his book on A Theory of Religion, he has a passage, he has a section on sacrifice. And he also says something like this, that what if Bachelard says that the death by fire, that death of consummation, is the least lonely of deaths, because I'm no longer alone in some sense. I've united myself with something larger than me. I'm part of something else. Then Bataille will take it even further. And he will say, for instance, that somewhere the desire to sacrifice oneself, is the desire to separate oneself from the world of things, from the world in which I am just a thing. I am a cog in the wheels. I am instrumental in achieving, in earning a living. I live my life for the sake of society, for the sake of an income, for the sake of, I live for the sake of all kinds of ends that have nothing to do with something ecstatic, something total that lives inside me, that there is a yearning for something else, for the moment of unintelligible caprice. It's wonderful, wonderful, crazy expressions. A moment in which you give up everything in order to gain everything. There's a kind which is total giving. It doesn't have to mean giving up your life. It can mean giving a coal to the fire. Not something sensible, not something, you don't do it in order to get warmer. You do it just in a mode of sacrifice, give up, make space in yourself so that you're capable of what he calls intimacy. You leave the world the order of one order of things, which is the order of duration, which is I want to go on being me as long as possible. I want to hold on to me and my identity as long as possible. You give up that and you look for the hidden order of intimacy, the secret order of giving up my identity, giving up who I really am as an individual in order to unite with a fire. And the fire can be the fire of love, can be the fire of hate, of erotic love, or very specifically. It can be the fires that Chazal say are man and woman. Man and woman are fires. There are two, ish, isha, right? They both have the word fire in them. But what else do they have? They have the yud in ish and the hey in isha, which is the name of God. Yud, hey. So somewhere, it's not a matter of denying that desire, that ish should meet ish, and in some way get beyond the thing status, the prudential nature of the world. But somehow and somewhere, God, if God is in that, then that what you have then is a possibility of true generation. Something can really come of that fire. It doesn't move towards destruction. Now that notion, and I think that's the last of my French authors that I'm going to offer you today. Although there was one other, somewhere to try to advocate for the values of insanity. That is the value of life in the moment, life in the intense moment. Have a look at the Gemara in Avodah Zarah in number 5, and then we'll come back to Avraham. Avraham and what kind of a desire he might have had for fire, which is a continuing motif in his life. And we'll start by pointing that out. But first, here's the Gemara, and I'm not going to read it through again. This is one that I'm going to tantalize you with. A man called Elazar ben Dordia, who was a well-known profligate. He was a real loose, I can never find the word when I'm looking for it, the speakable word for it. He went around every prostitute in the world. He was looking for sensual experience. That's all he cared for in the world. And he heard of a particular prostitute, and he went to her. She was very high class. And when they were in the middle, she said to him, "You are never going to do tshuva. You are never coming back from where you are now. This is you're the real thing." I don't know how she said it to him, but somehow he heard it as a provocation. He heard it as a challenge, and he suddenly started thinking better of his whole life. And he calls on all the forces of nature to unite with him in some way, to speak up for him, levakesh rachamim, to the mountains and the hills and the stars and the planets and all the forces of the world. He asks to ask for compassion from God for him. And they all answer him, "We have ourselves to worry about. We have to ask compassion for ourselves." In other words, we have our own identities. Don't get yourself mixed up with us. You can't summon us in that way to be with you and add our force to you. Right? We're also embedded in nature and in death and in destruction, and we would also like to carry on being as long as possible. We've got our work cut out for us. Don't try to make things complicated for us. You've got only yourself. And at that point, he puts his head between his knees and he bellows, Ga'ah, b'fchiyah. It's very intense. He bellows like an animal in weeping, and he understands that I have only myself to depend on, that I have to find a way of reaching God from this fetal position. He's bent over into himself, and parcha nishmato. And at that moment, he gave up the ghost. In that intensity, his life flew away. And so he's left now, right? In a way, it's a suicidal self-sacrifice. It's an intensity of the fire. He so much wants to move beyond being a thing towards uniting with spiritual meaning. And then at the end of the story, a very powerful ending of the story, a bat kol comes out, a heavenly voice comes out from heaven and says, Rabbi Elazar ben Dordia is invited into the life of the world to come. In other words, he's made it. Right? His movement, his soaring movement, his plunging movement, let's say, his plunging movement into not being has actually taken him up to God, and God welcomes him, justifies that way of living and dying. And then after that, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, founder of Torah Sheba'al Peh, the compiler of the Mishnah, he hears the story and he weeps. Bacha Rabbi. So notice that the great sinner is weeping and the great tzaddik is weeping. Why is he weeping? He says there are those who acquire their world over many years of hard work, and there are those who get it in one moment, b'sha'a achat. And that's the way it is. In other words, the heavenly voice has taught Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi something he didn't really want to learn. That's how I hear it. I think that's how it's usually understood. That is, acquiring one's world in one moment is not the preferred rabbinic way of living. that you live all your life, doing what you like, and then in one intense moment you become the Baal Tshuva. It's not what we educate towards, but at the same time, it's a valid. If it happens, it's valid. You can't be snobbish about it. You have to be flexible. There's a rhythm here. There are moments for this, and there are moments for that, and not only. The outrage from the point of view of Rabbi is not only that, but these such sinners are then called Rabbi, because the sinner is welcomed into the world to come as Rabbi Elazar ben Dordia. So suddenly, in one instant, he gets a smicha, he gets with all that implies. In other words, he becomes a tzaddik and a Talmud Chacham and everything. And you can feel that this is, from Rabbi's point of view, it undermines his whole way of being. That's what the rabbis are all about. And nevertheless, he accepts it. He has to understand that from God's point of view, yes, that's one of the modalities. That's one of the ways it works. And with this, we get to the main part of where we're going. What is Avraham's particular, specific way of thinking about sacrifice, self-sacrifice, the possibilities of the fire, the fear and desire for the fire? It has Avraham has a particular hidden story in his life. That's what I want to suggest. It's the psychoanalytic history of Avraham. It becomes clear through certain hints. One is the way fire appears in his life every now and then. There's a moment in which he experiences fire, and he has interesting reactions to it. One of them, for instance, working backwards, is with Sodom, chapter 19. With Sodom, Avraham looks out over Sodom, and he sees the burning city, and he sees Allah kitor haaretz kitor hakivshan. The smoke that's over the land rises up like the smoke of a furnace. And suddenly you have a simile there, an image in the text. What was it like? It was like the smoke. Now that is, take my word for it, if you don't you haven't got the material at your fingertips, but similes are not that common in the biblical text, I would say. It's certainly in 5 books of Moshe, in the Chumash itself. To use a simile like a furnace, that's not such a common practice in the text of the Torah. What is a furnace to Avraham? Why does Avraham look at Sodom and see, you can see where I'm going, that fiery furnace with which he had an early life connection? He was thrown into a fiery furnace and he was saved, right? That's what we know so far. But we're going to find as we explore that there is a murder. There's a hidden murder. It's a murder story, which is leaving clues all over the place in Abraham's experience, in his narrative. That's the first example. The second example of the use of fire is when he's praying for Sodom before the destruction of Sodom, and he says, as a kind of figure of speech, "Va'anochi afar va'efer." Who am I to disturb you, O God, with my pleas for lower and lower number of tzaddikim, of righteous people to survive? I'm just dust and ashes after all. Who am I? I'm nothing. So it's a moment of humility. It's a kind of, you might call it a dead metaphor. I'm dust and ashes, except that for Avraham, it's not dead. He's the first person to use it. The expression comes from him and from his life experience. Look at Rashi on it. This is the way Chazal detect the understory. Anochi afar va'efer, number 6. Ukvar hayiti ra'ui liyot afar al yidei hamlachim. I should already be dust at the hands of the kings. In other words, I should be dead in those battles against the kings. We're coming back to the Hirurim. That somewhere in a proper, really rational world, I should be dead. The efer al yidei Nimrod. And I should be ashes at the hands of Nimrod. in the fiery furnace. Now, what does it mean? I should be. Hayiti ra'ui liyot. I was fit to be. Lule rachamecha asher amduli. If it were not for your compassion that stood by me. In other words, there all but for the grace of God go I. I am ashes. That's really what he's saying. He's not simply thanking God for saving him, right? There's a line between the two things. It's not thank you, God, for saving me. It's by a razor's edge I was saved. In other words, properly I should be dead. In my inner experience, I was already dead. I died and I came back to life. In some sense, that is the operation of things. And there we have the power of the fire again. And most importantly, number 7. What do we read? Vayamat Haran al Pnei Terach Aviv. At the end of, just before Lech Lecha, we have the story of Avraham's family, and that the fact that he had a brother called Haran, who died before the face of Terach, his father. Mysterious description of Avraham's brother and his early death. The Chaye Aviv, while his father was still alive. That's very unusual. I think it's the first case that we have in all the genealogies of a son who dies in his father's lifetime. So there's something unusual about this story. What is that? So Rashi goes to the Midrash then and pushes it further. She'al Yedei Aviv met. That at the hand of his father, he died. That is, Haran was killed by his father. Now, that's not there in the original story. What's there in the original story? And then so Rashi goes on, Midrash goes on, to trace the story. And the story is about how Abraham was thrown into the fire furnace, and he was saved, yes. And Haran is sitting there thinking, belibo, in his mind, if Avraham wins this one, then I'll belong to him. I'll attach myself to him. I'll be of his party. And if Avraham loses, if he dies, then I won't belong to his party. And so when they asked Haran, who do you belong to? Are you joining the monotheists, or are you still one of the pagans? Haran answers, I belong to Avraham, because he saw that Avraham was saved. And what happened to Haran? It's bitter ending to the story. Haran is not saved because he didn't opt for the good for true reasons. He was just attaching himself to Avram's coattails. Now, that story, there are many ways in which one could talk about it, but what I want to draw out of it is this very simple idea that Avraham was going to be killed by his own father. That's the way Rashi puts it. His father brought him up for execution. And as far as anyone rationally could expect, Avraham was going to be burnt in fire. His father, virtually speaking, threw him into the fire. All right, he was saved. But then Haran really was killed. And so even though, his father hadn't intended to kill him, in the end, he is a victim of this story. So what you have here, if you combine the two events, the unfulfilled intention of the father on the one hand, and on the other hand, the unintended fulfillment with the brother, what you have is a filicidal movement on the part of the father. That the father was possessed of a desire to destroy his own son. And that is part of Avraham's earliest experience. And because of that, he's haunted by fire. Not only the fire that he was saved from, he should have been ashes in, but the fire that killed his brother, with all the feelings that might give rise to, one can imagine. For someone who's used to thinking around and overthinking, the guilt that might come along with that. In other words, Avraham has a fraught life in relation to the question of fathers killing children. Is that such an unusual movement on the part of fathers? Well, now it is. Now it lives only perhaps in Freud and his followers. Also there, it usually takes the form of the son trying to kill the father. Right? But there is, of course, that other possibility. In real life, we don't tend to see fathers killing children all that often. But in those times, one could say that this was a commonplace in pagan times. Perhaps it wasn't an astonishing thing that Avraham was asked to do. Avraham was used to it from his environment. That's what he was brought up to. He had always assumed that God was different, that God wasn't going to ask him this. But when God does ask him this, perhaps there is then a moment, or more than a moment, an experience of great confusion for Abraham. Where are we exactly in the world? Is this God like the others? I've spent my whole life teaching. Right? This is a theme that you find very strongly in commentaries, and especially in Hasidic commentaries. The added anguish to the whole story, not only to kill one's child and so on, but to lose the message of one's whole life, to undermine the monotheistic teaching of one's life, which was an ethical teaching, that God doesn't ask for the killing of children. Right? That we are not, that's not where we belong, in that very common background in which Avraham grew up. Now that it would be the greatest, perhaps, at a kind of spiritual level, that would be the greatest outrage for Avraham. I'm undermining everything that I thought I understood from God. But perhaps that is exactly what God wants me to do. What is, after all, ur custom, the expression ur, right, the furnace, ur as connected with fire? Perhaps, as Rashi says, ur also means, it's at the end of number 7, he quotes a grammarian, Menachem, whom he often quotes. What is ur? It's bik'ah, urim. Ur is a pit, a hole. Somewhere we're back in the pagan caves, right? Those smoky caverns of pagan life, of Greek civilization, where mysterious and dreadful things are done. Miscegenations of various kinds, yes, and sacrifices of various kinds to the gods. And a sense that only by going there can one get beyond the limitations of sanity. One achieves some kind of enlightenment by going there. That there's something about that movement. I put number 8 on your page because it's a midrash that presents us with a kind of evidence for an idea the midrash itself presents. Before Lech Lecha, we read that Terach dies. Vayamat Terach b'Charan. And so Rabbi Yitzhak raises a problem. He says, Avraham Avinu haya mefached. There he is again, being anxious. This time, he says, but if I obey God and the Lech Lecha command, and I leave my old father by himself in his old age, and I'll be Mechalel Shem Shemayim, I will undermine the basic duties of children to their fathers in the name of an enlightened new religion. How will that look? That will be a Chilul Hashem. If I abandon my father and go off on this religious quest. And God answers him, and it's the answer that is interesting in terms of our investigation. God answers him, Lecha ani potercha mikibud avaim. You have no need, I absolve you of the duty of honoring your father. No one else do I absolve, but you I do. And there's no explanation given. Why you and not anyone else? But in light of what we are now touching on, you can very well understand that God is telling Avraham, after you have gone through an experience of your father killing you and or your brother, that confusion, you might very well not feel any duty to your parents. So legally speaking, you don't have to worry, at least, about that kind of duty to the father. And number 9, the Mea Shiloach, and then I would like to bring things together. Going back to the Tower of Babel, going back to that story, what was the motive of that generation, Dor HaFlagah? After the destruction of the flood, they thought they would concentrate themselves all in one place, so they would become an expression of human unity, and so that evil would never have control over them, because they would have so much solidarity, human solidarity with each other, that they would be an entirely virtuous community. And so they built, that's why they built this civilization in what's called Eretz Shinar. That's the name of the place. Shinar, Shin Nun Ayin Resh. As we have learned in the Gemara, what does that stand for? That all the dead corpses of the flood were Nin Aru Sham, taken down to that lowest place in the world. And so they built their tower to reach the heavens, starting from a very low place, the lowest place in the world. That is the most sordid, death-ridden, deathly, destructive place in the world. All the dead bodies. The terror of death is at the basis of their civilization and their religion. That's where they place themselves in order to reach the heavens. And this is just the opposite of what God wants of human beings, says the Mea Shiloach. What does God want of human beings? The Beit HaMikdash is just the opposite of the Tower of Babel. That expresses a very high place, the highest place in the world, where everyone was united. All Israel were united there, and they crowned God there. So 2 forms of unity, of social or national unity. One is based on fear and dread and a will somewhere to live through the worst horrors, to reenact the worst horrors by way perhaps of vaccinating oneself against them. And the other is to base one's life of solidarity with others on a very high place. What does God, therefore, what is God, what is the message here then, is that what God doesn't want is a civilization in which people feel that they have fear naturally ingrained in them, that they are basing themselves on fear. They don't have to learn to fear. They don't have to teach themselves how to engage in fear of God, because fear is such a rudimentary and elemental condition of their lives, and that's what they express in the place in which they set their. Avraham, on the other hand, or as we'll see, or later the Beit HaMikdash, what has to happen there is that they will need yitztarchu avodah la'avodah. They will need work. They will need to work on those primal impulses, on those basic dreads and desires, and to find a place of unity and of identity with others through avodah, through work, not through assuming that what's in my nature is what I have to go on, but what is in my nature, I have to work with. I have to find a way of working through it, of working it, so that it can express something high and not something low. What I'm suggesting is that Abraham is always looking for that original place. And he's looking for it when he is going towards Har HaMoriah, and he sees the place from afar. It's as if that's the place he recognizes as having some kinship with what he came from. But there is the fire, and there is the ultimate demand. Only in this occasion, it's up high and not down there. It's visible. It's something that can be seen. It's not in the mysterious dark canyons. There's an archaeological find. It's called the Death Pit of Ur. Actually called the Death Pit of Ur, from the year 2600 BCE. Interesting dating of it. in which, for instance, the king, when the king was buried in a kind of deep garbage heap, a pit, the king was buried and all of his servants were buried with him. In an expression of solidarity, his live servants would go down into that pit to be burned together with the body. So there is a solidarity in death, in the unspeakable, a sense of horror, ultimate horror. Oh, the horror, Joseph Conrad has as the center of his book, The Heart of Darkness. Right? This is a demonic structure, which is something that we have inside ourselves as well. Have a look at the geological midrash in number 11a. Avraham saw the place from far away. What does it mean from far away? It teaches you that at first the place was a deep place. There was no mountain there at first. There was a cave. There was a pit down there. It was deep down there. But when God intended to rest his presence on that place, this is not going to be a pagan place, and to make it into a sanctuary to him, he said, it's not the way of a king to reside in a valley, but in a high place, high and exalted and beautified. That is something that's gone through a process of becoming beautiful. Right? It's sublimated, as Freud would say. It's been worked on, the impulse has been worked on, and it's moved up to a very high place. And then there's the geological image. God hinted to all the surrounding valleys that they should gather, the mountains should gather, the area surrounding the valley, that the mountains should gather together to one place to become one place for the presence of God. And that's why it's called Har HaMoriah. Out of fear of God, it became a mountain. That is, not out of fear did the valley become a mountain. Fear would have left it as a deep place. But the fear of God, which is apparently something entirely different, because it involves work, it involves human work. That's what made it into a high place that can be talked about, that can be seen. It's not hidden as a mystery. It's up there. Somewhere it enters into the rational world. Right? It becomes a world with which one can engage. And here I want to look with you at the passage from Winnicott that I put at the end of your Hebrew sources, if you can find it. Yes. Do you have it? Do you have it? Number 15. It must be asked here, he says. He deals here in this essay. It's a very powerful and important essay. He deals here with the patient who suffers from a fear of breakdown. He's always worrying. He's always worried that at some point he's going to not be able to hold himself together. Somewhere he's going to break down, fear of madness, that's one way of putting it. He's not going to be able to hold himself together. And he's haunted by this irrational fear. And Winnicott now wants to convey the very strange idea. He calls it a queer idea, a queer thought, that he now describes. It must be asked here, why does the patient go on being worried by this that belongs to the past? What's the queer idea? That if he's worried about the fear of breakdown, that tells you that he has already broken down at some point in childhood, at some early moment of his life. He's had such a terrible experience, a traumatic experience of horror of some kind, of something impossible happening, and is not able actually to remember it. Why not? Why can't he just remember it and in some way work it through and get rid of it? The answer must be that the original experience of primitive agony cannot get into the past tense unless the ego can first gather it into its own experience. In other words, the patient must go on looking for the past detail which is not yet experienced. This search takes the form of a looking for this detail in the future. So his patient is always expecting and worrying that something will happen which has already happened. Only look at the next paragraph. The patient is ready. When you have a patient, he's advising analysts, this kind of patient, he is ready for some kind of acceptance of this queer kind of truth, that what is not yet experienced did nevertheless happen in the past. Then the way is open for the agony to be experienced in the transference, that's here and now in his relation to the analyst. He can be having experience of being let down, of falling apart, falling into bits in a way, in reaction to the analyst's failures and mistakes. The patient needs to remember this past thing, which he can't remember. It's not possible to remember something that has not yet happened. Why has it not yet happened? Because the patient was not there for it to happen to. Now you can see how he's trying to say something that's almost impossible to get at. And I want to take just 5 minutes to try to unpack this. He's talking about an unimaginable state, unless one has actually experienced it, or unless one has read about it, or one's talked to someone who knows about it. Something has to have happened to make one understand this irrational possibility, that one had an experience, but one didn't have the experience. One couldn't allow the experience to happen to one at the time, because one wasn't yet fully defended as a human being. One didn't have what he calls the ego strength to take it on at that time. One was a child, let's say, and therefore it happened, but it's as if it didn't happen. I can't remember it afterwards. And then, at the time of an analysis, in therapy, let's say, perhaps if the analyst is very brave, he has a lot to say about this, you shouldn't take on such cases unless you think you can handle them. Because we're dealing here with a possibility of madness, and with the patient's fear of madness, which will lead him, on the one hand, to keep away from any such memory. But on the other hand, he is now supported by his relation with the analyst. And there's a sense, after all, that he's now more mature than he once was. And he has better defenses, better ways of dealing with traumatic. And so perhaps in the course of the analysis, he can allow himself that kind of limited madness, which will be actually a sign of health, because it will allow him then to reach to the madness and allow him to get beyond it. Now, that allowing oneself, because one has the strength, because of certain conditions that you have now that you didn't once have, I want to suggest that that is Avraham's story, and that's the purpose of the Lech Lecha, this Lech Lecha command. The Akedah, from the point of view of the relationship between God and Avraham, I'm not thinking here about Yitzhak. We'll think about Yitzhak in future weeks. The victim. We'll think about Sarah. We haven't talked about her. What will be the impact on her of this? But when it comes to Avraham, Avraham lives his life as the survivor of a pagan civilization. It's not just that he's left it behind him physically, geographically, and he's gone to look for the Holy Land where he will settle down and live in a completely different way. He's got it deep inside him. He's got that desire for the fire which he saw enacted when his father, as it were, killed himself, his brother. Right? We're in the world now of reverie, of what must exist in Avraham's, call it unconscious, in his unconscious mind. The terror of that event, and perhaps some understanding of the desire for it, which belongs very much to the pagan world. The pagan world knows about that desire. What does God want of Avraham? Not to leave that behind him, clean break. We can't make a clean break with that, but to work with that. To work with that desire in as far as it is, in the end, productive. That is, to live more, a life that is more than a life of just going on living and rationally accumulating credits. Perhaps there could also be a possibility of the encounter with fire. the encounter with fire, which means Vatem Devekim B'Hashem. Now, we have it in all kinds of hidden ways, even if it's not our official agenda. You are the ones who cling to God. That's your way of being alive. Chayim kulchem hayom. Atem hadvik. You cling to God. And so Chazal raised the problem, but God is a consuming fire. There you have the paradox. You can't cling to a consuming fire without getting destroyed, can you? Ah, yes, you can, the sages say. And they put it in a very domesticated way. They say, well, you can by, for instance, furthering the interests of the righteous in this world. You can marry the daughter of a scholar, or you can further a scholar's business interests. That's a way of clinging to the godly in this world. Now, I think that one of the dangers of this kind of interpretation is that it makes it all sound so cozy and practical in the end. So how do you cling to God? Forget about that incalculably generous moment that has to do with the fire, with the life in the moment, but rather a way of living over many years in the world. You look after the righteous. We're translating life over life in one moment to life in the world. I think that's a misreading. Chazal are trying to make us understand that there is a real meaning to clinging to God, who is a living fire, who's a consuming fire. And we find ways to sublimate it. We find but that doesn't mean that critical moment is not there, that sense of the intensity of, there is a mode of yesh koneh olamo b'sha'a achat. And that's something that we want, and perhaps we should want, even if it involves a certain kind of risk. And then the question is, how do we work? How do we work that rhythm between many years, life over many years, and the life of almost unspeakable intensities? Life a moment of sacrifice of the same separate self, where one becomes merged with something else. Each person according to his or her capacity to work with the two opposites. I think I'll stop there since we're a little over time. I'd like to take